We're going to end with the beginning. This is the first slide we had 23 lessons ago when we first introduced meetings with the masterpieces in the same way I've introduced it many times in the first class, with just this barrage of art that's in our faces, and sometimes going through crowds in order to see the masterpieces. And I began with a metaphor about opening a door, wondering how many of you know what that door might be to. It's in Rome, and those guards there, they're not Italian, they're Swiss. They're Swiss guards guarding something very special. And that's the Sistine Chapel, one of the greatest collections of masterpieces in the world, by Botticelli, by Raphael, and of course by Michelangelo. It's a barrage. It hits you in the face. When I first saw it, I remember I had a little mirror and I'd look down at the mirror so I could see that ceiling, which of course is miles away. And you really can't pick up any of the details. You don't have a real personal connection with the art. Looking through the entire ceiling, people usually look for one particular piece that you see a little bit right of center. And that's the creation of Adam. And here goes my metaphor again, because as God is, and I'm not equating myself with God in any way, but as God is giving consciousness to Adam, who's just about to reach out his finger so that that spark is created, so that he has consciousness, there's just a little bit of magic that happens. And when that spark happens, it's very similar to the spark that happens when you look at art and just something touches you and you become one with the piece and with the artist. And so it's just with the hope that you will have a few of those sparks, maybe very few, as we go through the class today and as we've gone through the past lessons. Our theme today is colors in art. This is the cover of a book that I'm showing you, and we're starting off with one of your pop quizzes. Whose colors blast behind art? Well, you might notice that those are the colors of the sky in the Scream, which we've looked at several times. We're going to be looking at a few practical matters, and we're going to be going a little bit more academically today, trying to go through some of the basics of painting, but also going in a little bit more order, because I usually haven't talked about schools of art or eras. So we're going to be going a little bit more academically, and we're going to start with just paint. We sort of take it for granted, but look at this medieval picture here. The lady is putting the lovely blue mantle on her painting. In the background, she has an assistant who is making paint. And paint is pigment. Pigment is color. That's the thing that we're looking for. And that's the thing that we have to understand. It's not automatically. So when the pigment is ground like that, with that mortar and pestle, it is mixed with a binder that might be oil. At first, it could have been egg or water, and then it's sort of diluted with water solvent to make it whether thick or thin. I'm going to be showing you a video now, a part of a video, it's going to be online, that tells you a little bit more about the history of paint.
Many innovations have been made since then. At the beginning of the Bronze Age, people realized that if you can grind up one type of rock to make paint, then you can grind up other rocks as well. So, around 3000 BC, lots of new mineral-based colors began to appear. Favorites among the ancient Egyptians include orpiment, yellow, azurite, blue, and malachite, green. This tomb ceiling may have been painted with azurite, but more likely it's painted in Egyptian blue. Egyptian blue was made by grinding sand, lime, sodium carbonate, and copper ore together, then heating them to a high temperature. Invented during the 4th dynasty, Egyptian blue was the first artificial pigment ever made. Another Bronze Age innovation is fresco. a method of painting that involves applying dry pigments mixed with water directly to wet lime plaster. When the plaster dries, the painting becomes part of the plaster itself. So as long as the plaster survives, even in pieces, the fresco will survive. The oldest frescoes date from the 1600s BC and were created by the Greek Bronze Age Minoan and Mycenaean civilizations. Fresco will be the painting medium most often used during Roman times, both for wall painting and for smaller decorative works such as these found recently in Pompeii. Note the wall where the plaster has fallen off. Fresco is also the medium used by the great mural artists of the late Middle Ages through the 18th century. Artists such as Giotto, Masaccio, Michelangelo, and Tiepolo all worked extensively in fresco. Until the 15th century, panel paintings and easel paintings were made using egg tempera. Egg tempera is a water-based paint that is mixed with egg yolk to make it permanent. This famous painting by Botticelli is done in egg tempera. I bet you thought it was done in oil paint. In the 15th century, however, oil paint was a brand new medium. Well, not exactly brand new. It was invented in Asia in the 600s AD and brought to Europe during the 11th century, where it was only used to paint furniture and decorative items. But in the first decades of the Renaissance, artists in Northern Europe, such as Jan van Eyck, began using oil to paint pictures, not just furniture. The stunning detail that can be achieved by applying layer upon layer of oil glazes changed art forever. Italian Renaissance historian Giorgio Vasari credits Van Eyck for inventing oil paint, but what he really did was popularize it. Be that as it may, by the beginning of the 16th century, the period known as the High Renaissance, oil paint had eclipsed egg tempera to become the painting media of choice for easel painters. From then on, until acrylic paint was perfected in the 1960s, almost all easel painters in both Europe and America aspired to be oil painters. But there was a catch. The artists or their assistants had to grind and mix the paint themselves, just like in the Stone Age. Although by the 19th century, paints mixed by a colorman were available. Then in 1841, the American portraitist John Goff Rand invented a method of packaging paint in metal sealable tubes. Tube paint was one of painting's greatest innovations because it made painting in oils possible outside of a studio setting. Hand-mixed paint is messy and difficult to transport, but paint in tubes is easy to pack up and carry, and tubes can be tightly sealed to prevent them from spilling or drying out. Pierre-Auguste Renoir explained, without paint in tubes, there would have been no Impressionism. A new era of painting had begun. Now everyone, amateur as well as professional, could use oil paint both indoors and out, with no grinding or mixing required.
So we now have a little bit of an academic background, and you have a look forward as to the progression of the different eras or schools. Talking about color, a little bit of a regression. I don't know about you, but whenever I got a new box of Crayolas, I never got one that had as many as 96 colors, I don't think. But that array of those beautiful, beautiful, unbroken, unused Crayolas and that wonderful smell was one of my favorite things. Well, I started learning the names very early. I mean, here's 96. I don't know if I know 96 names, but there are names like yellow ochre and red umber. And then there was flesh, which is kind of weird. Well, that's where my digression comes in. I've talked about my woman that is the daughter that I wish I'd have, dear Gretchen. And I met her when I taught her how to do product development at an educational material and toy company. She invented people colors. And I can remember her going around the offices at where we worked with her little Pantone book of colors and matching it to people's skins. This picture is still in their catalog because that was about 40 years ago. We're going to go through the primary colors now and talk about some painters who concentrated just some paintings on just these colors, just to sort of appreciate the fact that some colors shine. Of course, we know now that there's such an array of them. Well, the earliest red was used in the cave paintings, and they would have had iron-rich soil, which we've all seen. We certainly see it, I believe, in Sedona and those rocks. And if you use those rocks to sort of carve into the side of a cave, you can make art. And then there was the Mexican bug. They discovered thousands of years ago, it was in Mesoamerican culture in Mexico, that if they took the bug off a prickly pear, this cochineal bug, and squeezed it, there would be a red pigment that would get on their hands and on their clothes. And somebody thought, wow, we can make that into paint. Well, it's still being used. It was very expensive. It took as many as 70,000 poor little dried insects to make a pound of dye. So using cochineal red was a sign of a very expensive, a very important kind of a painting when it was first used. For example, on this one, and there's a little pop quiz here, do you recognize the Mannerist painter who was Greek but worked in Spain? Mannerism being the fact that he would elongate his figures the way that's done here. Well, he would have used that cochineal paint in Spain, but of course the Spanish were getting the pigment from Mexico. And yes, that's El Greco. I don't know if there are any others. I looked for other disrobing of Christ paintings. I didn't see any others with him arrayed in this red. Once again, the red is being shown as giving honor to Christ in this situation, and shows that it's a very important painting, worthy of the cathedral at Toledo. And here's Anthony Van Dyck. You can't always recognize his paintings because of the Van Dyck beard, but you certainly see one here. But what really takes the cake is the big red flowing cape that would have been out of cochineal red, showing how important this man who has commissioned the painting from Anthony Van Dyck is, which is the reason he had his portrait done. And here is another man who wanted to have his portrait done right after he was crowned. And this portrait, drenched in red, not necessarily cochineal red, it's quite controversial. Some critics have called it a stylistic mess. Some say that it looks like it's dripping blood. What the painter says is that he wanted to use the red because he wanted to de-emphasize the uniform. And also, he wanted to show the importance of the fact that this is the first after he was crowned. So he has the butterfly, the metamorphosis from the Prince of Wales to the King of England. He also is showing with the butterfly that King Charles is a great proponent of saving the environment. Well, H.M., in his typical style, well, he had many styles, but he often had this style where he has pattern on pattern and where he has a window, has given us a harmony in red. The whole thing is put together with the red, but the red wouldn't be as important if it weren't contrasted with that complementary color of the green there. Who is it? Let's see. Well, that's Henri Matisse, and he really went wild with the red when he did his studio. Really, the main idea of this painting is the color red, but then it pops out with some of the elements in his studio. You can see a photograph of the studio on the left. Jose Clemente Orozco, Mexican painter, decorated the niche in the dining hall at Pomona College in Claremont in California. And this is Prometheus again. We've seen many paintings of Prometheus. Here we have him up with the gods, beyond the gods, grasping the fire, so that the fire, the red of the fire, is the predominant theme of the whole piece. Well, I was absolutely amazed when I was looking at some of G.O.'s work. how much these two paintings are related, entirely different subjects. The one on the right with the red hill and bones, so typical of this artist, and the top of the Prometheus. And what we have here in both cases is that the composition of the painting is what's so similar, and the colors, although they are two different subjects. And then, of course, was Georgia O'Keeffe. Look at what she's done with that flower. Another one of her signature subjects. Look on the right-hand side, but where the petal is sort of folded back, where she has a little bit of shadow there, where we get that little bit of three dimension. Again, those beautiful fluid lines of Georgia O'Keeffe. Who did the red linen? By the way, this artist's self-portrait is on the right. The way that he's done this is so similar to what Yo did with the King Charles portrait, just popping out the face. Who did that? Who's our artist? Yes, it's Andy Warhol, who gave us red in his soup cans and gave us a red Marilyn, and uses multiple colors in these multiples that he does to show that celebrities are so like commodities in the culture of the 60s when he was working. Elena Osterwalder is Mexican, and her goal with her artwork is to preserve the red and the papers, the colors of the Mesoamericans before the conquest. So she makes her artwork using the model paper and using the pigment from the cochineal bug. And this happens to be a room that she created with that. Let's go to blue. 100 shades of blue, and I'm sure that there are many, many more. Blue Horses is by an artist whose initials are FM. We've seen this before. It's an absolutely magnificent work. The colors of blue, of course, are fabulous, but also the fact of these lines that are so similar to what we just talked about with Georgia O'Keeffe, the fluidity of the lines that are echoed in the mountains beyond, and the intertwining of those horses to make a beautiful trinity. Well, Chris Wood, we had one of her horse ridings last week from Riding with the Masterpieces, gave us a wonderful ekphrastic poem. An ekphrastic poem is a poem that's written to art about the large blue horses. It's cut off here, and I have the original much larger on my website. I'm only going to read the left side. The right side has to do with the fact that Franz Marc was killed in World War I when he was only 36. I just can't imagine what kind of art might have come if he'd lived longer. But it talks about the chaos that you have in war. And she equates that with the feeling you get for the painting. So I'm going to read the left side. Blue, blue horses standing in holy trinity, harmony, purity, peace. Franz, pantheist, student of theology, seer of divinity in earth, nature, the universe. You paint in code, a palette of reds, yellows, and blues, a metaphysical language. Why blue horses? Masculinity, spirituality, blue, blue horses. What is it that you see? Chris is in our class, and I think she's owed a big hurrah for this wonderful poem. And she did a lot of research. Franz Marc was really had studied theology. He was a very spiritual person, and he did see many spiritual meanings in the colors that he would use. We saw Botticelli in the video. We're acquainted with Botticelli. Here is the blue that we have been talking about. Blue was a very, very costly pigment, because it was ground in the Renaissance from the lapis lazuli gemstone, and it was as expensive as gold. So it was used on paintings to show, like we showed in red with the cochineal earlier, to show the expense that the artist has gone to for a commission, and also to enhance the person. So according to my research, that's the reason that you always see the Virgin Mary in blue. This is the ceiling of the Scrovegni Chapel at Padua. And it is, when you walk in, the blue just hits you in the face. Probably Giotto used a azurite mixed in with the lapis lazuli because it's so expensive. But the whole feeling when you come in is if you do have sort of a heaven above. And this is where all those angels of Giotto, where you can find those in this art. Here again in a religious painting is Fra Angelico. There is a blue called Fra Angelico blue. You can see the lapis lazuli up at the top, and you can see the pigment down at the bottom that would have to be mixed, in this case, probably with oil. In this painting, you see in the upper left-hand corner, the sun, and inside is the dove. That's the Holy Spirit. It's coming down to the Virgin Mary, who is being told by Gabriel that she is going to be giving birth to Christ. The birth of Christ, of course, is to expiate the sins of the world that started with the expulsion of Adam and Eve, who you see in the garden on the left. The garden also symbolizes Mary's virginity, and you see angels back there. Notice the blue of her mantle. Notice the blue used on the ceiling of that portico. There's another rock that could be ground up for some of the pigment, and look at the use of it in that wonderful velvet pouch. I'm thinking back to that wing that we had painted by Durer. Remember how I remarked on the texture? I feel as if I can feel that velvet, and it's so deep with that beautiful blue. And of course, there's our girl in the blue headdress that Vermeer put on her to make her look a little bit exotic. If you saw the movie of the girl with the pearl earring, you would have seen kind of a sexy scene where Vermeer is teaching the girl with the pearl earring, who in that case was supposed to be one of his servants, how to grind the pigment. So it's kind of a sexy scene. Here is Henri Matisse again on the left. This is a self-portrait on the left. At that time, it was quite a fashion to walk around in pajamas during the day for your lounge wear. And he is confronting his soon-to-be wife. And according to some of the scholars that I read, he's telling her, I love you very much. We'll have a great marriage, except my art comes first. I'm not sure if that's really true, but it makes a good story. And I was so taken by this that it reminds me of the painting that we've looked at before, we had in Writing with the Masterpieces, by David Hockney, called Mr. and Mrs. Clark and Percy. Percy is a slang term for a male part in the UK. And here we see the cat that Hockney's named Percy on the lap of his friend, and he's across from his wife. This is a breakup picture. These are friends who soon after that will break up due to Mr. Clark's infidelity. But it's so similar with that window separating the two and the robe. So Hockney he may have seen the Matisse, I don't know. When we talk about the blues or say that we have the blues, we think about music, and sometimes we think about Picasso, who had his blue period. Uh-oh, I gave it away. I knew I'd do that, and I'm pretty sure you probably all figured out that it was Picasso. Look at not only the sad feeling that we get from the blue permeating these pictures, but also the positions of the people. The old man bent over the guitar, perhaps singing a form of the blues, his tatters, his age. And on the right, the family. We don't know what the tragedy is, but it's so very visible in the way that Picasso has shown the figures. I don't know if you know Yves Klein. We haven't talked about Yves Klein, but I'm showing him because he invented his own blue color. It's called International Klein Blue. You see he's painting his hand as well as a bust. And look at the action painting down below. It's done in a very unusual manner. And that's called anthropometry. He coats his model with the blue paint and then has them pose on top of paper. That's the artwork. I was really thrilled when I saw this picture from W magazine where Kendall Jenner is doing a little riff on Klein. At the Monterey Museum of Art right now, you can go and see, I talked about David Laguerre being there, but also you can see Into the Blue, where the museum has taken some of their items, all different artworks in blue colors from their permanent collection. Our final primary color is yellow. You see some shades of it and you see things that might be attached to it. I don't know about you, but I think it was in the 70s when we read our colors. Did you ever do that? I mean, it doesn't really take colors for me to figure out what I'm like, but it helped. And especially when they were very positive, like the ones that they have down here, from creativity to loyalty. There is a very typical look to this painting. We've seen this English painter many times. This is a picture in Venice. The color yellow often was made from a pigment that was obtained from a cow that ate only mango leaves. And it was the urine of the cow that was used. Also, this artist used chrome yellow, which is lead-based and known to cause delirium. And Vincent van Gogh also used it. But there were critics that said this guy uses so much yellow, maybe he has jaundice or a vision disorder. So yes, he uses a lot of yellow and he gives us that very misty, wonderful look. So the whole picture of Venice has an entirely different feeling. And that was Turner. So who's yellow now? According to his roommate and his frenemy, his fellow painter, this is what he said. Oh, yes, he loved yellow, did good Vincent, the painter from Holland, gleams of sunlight warming his soul, which detested fog. Yes, there's a big contrast between the yellow used in these paintings and that misty fog enshrouded painting that we just saw from Turner. And yes, that's Vincent van Gogh. Look at the yellows here. His colors are so clear. I think that's one of the reasons he's one of my favorite painters. Also, with his brush strokes. Look on the left, how all of the wheat is going to the left with those broad brush strokes. And it's matching the way the smoke in that industrial setting that I'm often bringing up, because industry is so new, they put it into their paintings. So the wind is bringing the smoke the same way. And on the right, we see the way the wheat is all being bound up in those wonderful swirlies that Van Gogh so often uses. Our little reaper there in green is kind of lost. Whose little yellow horses? We saw the big blue horses. These are yellow horses, done in the same way that we saw this artist do them in blue. And of course, that's Franz Marc. Look at how he did the same type of thing in just this yellow cow, contrasted again with the background. And again, with those very fluid lines. And then even the little doggy who's posing on the snow has the beautiful feeling of the curved line. Okay, here's another digression and also a regression. And that has to do with the color black. My father was an animator at the Walt Disney Company when they were first working on Snow White. Snow White was the first full-length animated feature, and it was the first animated work to use color. They had to just run around trying to find colors that would stick to those transparent cells on which women would paint the colors on these drawings that the animators made. So they had to get the colors. Here's a typical collection of colors that could have been used in Snow White under the picture of the woman painting the cell. Once my father started working at Walt Disney, they had a very big strike. The animators wanted to join the guild. My father documented that strike on film, and I have some of that documentation on my website. Most of the people who were going on strike, which they won, were let go, let's say nicely. My father ended up with his own studio called Ray Patton Productions. He started at the beginning of the 50s when the golden age of television began. Television was new. People had aerials on their rooftops. They were going to furniture stores so they could watch the television set. And my father was doing commercials for television. Well, television did not have color. So when I went to my father's paint cabinet, when I would work there, all I saw were paints going from white to black, and I don't know how many, maybe 50 shades of gray in between. Kerry James Marshall uses black. He uses different shades of black. We think black is black. He is black, he's African American. He also says, I'm showing black people. I'm not showing brown or tan people. And I want you to remember that. So his people are particularly in very deep shades of black. Here is the heritage that he's taken from the Renaissance, Vermeer. We looked at Matisse's studio. The artist studio has been the subject of painting for a very long time. He says, this is my heritage. I'm a painter too. He references Matisse's studio by showing the painting with a red background. You can see the painting itself on the left-hand side. He has a still life like they had in the Dutch Renaissance on the table. See the skull, the memento mori, and look at the other heritage he claims. Do you see it under the table? Yeah, it's Franz Marc's Yellow Dog. Here is another heritage. And of course, that is the portrait of the artist. Very different. Here, first of all, most of the artists that we look at throughout art history are white. Most of them are female. This lady is neither. And we don't usually have an unfinished painting of this painting behind the artist. And if you look carefully, you see it's a paint by numbers. What Kerry James Marshall is doing is putting the viewer into the painting. Now we're going to do a brief history in art. Don't worry, we're just not going to do, every detail, but it's what I haven't done before, and that is to go chronologically and talk about what characterizes the different periods of art. And we're basing that on colors, showing the color palettes that we're using. So in the Italian Renaissance, in this beautiful birth of Venus, we have those very natural colors in the background. Everything is sort of played back. And the contrast that we get here between that fabulous flowing hair is in the green background is absolutely gorgeous. And here is his famous spring. We have hundreds of different identifiable plants in this bursting spring here. We have the Zephyr god on the right, who is giving life to spring by blowing on her. You see the flowers that are starting to spring out. We see Venus in the middle. We see the three graces that have that typical Botticelli see-through material, and that's Mercury on the left. After the Renaissance, we have the Baroque, and I think the best example of Baroque is to look at MC's painting with his use of chiaroscuro, because it's the contrast between light and shadow that really distinguishes Baroque. Baroque painting is dramatic. And in order to get that dramatic feeling, we have that kind of a contrast between the light and the dark called chiaroscuro. Caravaggio was a master of this. On the left, you see his David with the head of the Goliath. Goliath is a self-portrait of Caravaggio. He was a very troubled person. We're going to see a video in a second. Died very young. But his paintings are magnificent in getting the viewer to feel that they can get into the painting, go around the back, and come out the front. Three-dimensional quality with his chiaroscuro. Okay, who's that guy? Some of you know who the guy is there. That guy is a painter that I dated when I was in college. And his desire as a painter was to be able to do that with his painting, to get the viewer into the painting, to identify with it. He wanted to have that same quality as Caravaggio. Okay, with that digression and regression, let's learn more about Caravaggio.
The art world in Italy and beyond had seen the High Renaissance with its paintings devoted to ideal beauty, linear perspective, and balanced compositions yield to mannerism and its exaggerated forms, strange juxtapositions, complex, sometimes overly sophisticated paintings that emphasized the artist's talents and fanciful impulses. Then you walk into a church in Rome and see this. It must have been shocking, maybe even too much to handle for some. It's dramatic, crystal clear, so, I don't know, so visceral that you feel exposed, vulnerable, involved. It's Caravaggio's The Calling of St. Matthew. You're seeing the moment that Jesus Christ calls Matthew, the tax collector, to be his disciple. As it says in Matthew 9:9, Jesus saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," he told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. In the scripture, it's an immediate reaction, but Caravaggio inserts a moment here, a moment of hesitation. Jesus enters what looks like a tavern, obscured by St. Peter and almost entirely in shadow except for his hand, arm, the side of his face, and the slightest glimmer on the halo over his head. He points out Matthew, who instead of getting up and going like the gospel says, points at himself as if to say, "Who? Me?" To the left of him, two of his fellow moneymen don't even realize a divine presence has arrived, consumed by their worldly matters. To Matthew's right, two young men are startled in opposite directions, one leaning toward Jesus and one leaning away, amplifying Matthew's moment of indecision. The scene makes sense right away, but Caravaggio goes much further than just intelligibility. What really shocks about this painting is, of course, the light. The intensely dramatic play of light and shadow called chiaroscuro, or when it's so pronounced like this, tenebrism. The harsh light coming from the upper right of the canvas, like divine illumination, points out Matthew more forcefully than Jesus does. But it's not unrealistic. The opposite, in fact. It's a kind of light we know. We've seen it before. That color, that angle, it triggers our memories of late afternoon sunlight when we're reminded how dramatic reality really is. And what's more, light from that side angle removes the need to add background space to simulate three dimensions. The way it wraps around the characters does that job just as well, so that Caravaggio can put a flat wall or a dark space behind his scene, and his figures pop out like they're on a stage or in a dreamlike void, a kind of hyper reality. See how he achieves the same effect in this painting, Judith beheading Holofernes, or David with the head of Goliath, or the crucifixion of St. Peter, or my personal favorite, the taking of Christ, which was only rediscovered in 1990, by the way. I mean, it's like you're there, crowded in that group. You can hear the metal of the knight's armor, the scream of St. John fleeing. You can feel Judas's hand on Jesus' arm, his kiss as he betrays his friend. You're caught up in it. You know, it's worth noting that this is exactly the kind of painting that the Catholic Church wanted during the Counter-Reformation as it pushed back against Protestantism. One of the Council of Trent's decrees was that art should strive to help Christians understand and reconnect with their faith. With so many illiterate people, painting was a crucial way to transmit the stories of Catholic doctrine. And Caravaggio's work is not only easily understandable, it stirs deep emotion in its immediacy. It puts passion into the passion of Jesus. See, Caravaggio's other great innovation was in his casting of real people in these biblical roles. He painted from life, so his Mary Magdalene, for example, was someone you might see walking the streets of Rome in the year 1600. To some, this realism was vulgar, but to others looking for humanity in these stories, Caravaggio's figures were revelatory, heightening the feelings of identification and involvement that the Church wanted from art. The irony, of course, is that Caravaggio himself was a deeply sinful person, by all accounts a complete jerk, given to street brawls and petulant outbursts, which often resulted in jail time. In 1606, he killed a man in a duel and was forced to flee Rome. He bounced around Italy after that, getting in trouble everywhere he went, until he finally died, we think, of illness in 1610 at age 38. No doubt his penchant for violent extremes contributed to the haunting renderings of violence in his work, but the romantic stereotype of the mad and frenzied artist who dies before his time is a tired one, and you can't help but wonder what he might have shown us had he just calmed down and lived twice as long. Because what we have got is extraordinary. You can see that he was grappling with his sins and his faith in his work. In The Taking of Christ, for example, he paints himself into the scene, rushing in with the guards, eager to witness the betrayal, the arrest of Jesus. He holds a lantern, signifying the power of the artist to illuminate the stories that mean the most to us, to make them personal, realer than real. Maybe it is possible to know what it was like for people to see a Caravaggio painting for the first time in 1605. His light has traveled 400 years through time undimmed.
Show you on the left is Caravaggio's. They showed it in the video. And on the right is the same subject from Artemisia Gentileschi, who was a very, very successful Baroque artist. Her father was a Renaissance artist. She was a Baroque artist. And she is showing the same subject. And I'd like you to just make your own decision as to what you think about the difference between the way Caravaggio portrayed Judith as she is taking off the head of the man who is threatening her town, and the Judith on the right. Which one shows more strength? Which picture? How do you judge and think for yourself about how much you relate, what kind of a relation you have to those two? On the left is a self-portrait of Artemisia Gentileschi, and she's showing her strength in this. It's also Baroque, so you see that it has that three-dimensional kind of feeling. Artemisia, when she was quite young, was raped. And it was her mentor, it was a friend of her father's. She went to the judge and said, I want to have my honor taken back. I want to have these people arrested. She succeeded in that. Ironically, these two paintings are of Susanna and the Elders, where Susanna is being approached by some men in the background who want to have their way with her. And she's fearful, she's fending them off. Well, about 40 years later, she did the same thing, and it looks as if she's trying to talk them out of it. There are those scholars about Artemisia who's now coming back into popularity. People are discovering her and her great work. You say, we really just can't dwell on the fact that she had this background. We have to look at the paintings themselves. But I think that it is interesting. What Dutch lover of gold painted the man in the golden helmet in 1650? When I was in graduate school, I took some summer courses at the Louvre in Paris, and afterwards went on a Eurail pass to go around to the great museums in Europe. This was 1961. It was a week before the Berlin Wall went up. The first museum that I went to from Paris was the Berlin Museum because I wanted desperately to see the man in the golden helmet. And I wasn't disappointed. The gold on it looks as if it was carved into the canvas. And it was a wonderful experience. A not so wonderful experience is that lately they're saying, we're not so sure it's a Rembrandt. Could have been one of his students. I would rather not have heard that. Look at the gold that he's put into the picture here on the right. This is the Danae. She's waiting for the entry of Zeus to come through that curtain. He will impregnate her with a golden stream. And this artist, I know I already gave away the artist, is not showing either Zeus or not, but she will be the mother of Perseus. But what I thought was interesting is this Baroque look by this Dutch artist who is showing that light on her and then receding with the darkness with those highlights of gold, very typical of his style. And that, of course, was Rembrandt, since I mentioned it. This is kind of the picture that a lot of people have of Rembrandt. They know he's famous. You say things like, oh, that kid's going to be another Rembrandt, like he's the greatest artist. And so a lot of people think this is not a particularly exciting picture, but it's a picture that poor Rembrandt, who died a pauper, would have been loved to have had this commission, to have this syndicate of drapers have their picture done. And it is on the cover of Dutch Masters Cigars, in case you ever want to, show off. If they pass them around at a cocktail party, you say, oh yeah, that's a Rembrandt. But he's much more famous for the Night Watch. I've shown several times. Look at the crowd around it at the Rijksmuseum. And I'm showing it here because it has that quality of the chiaroscuro that we talked about with Caravaggio, with my old boyfriend, the painter. Look how that sword on the right is sticking out of the frame, as is the hand in the upper left-hand corner of that detail. Okay, there's the boyfriend again. This is another shameless digression. He was a year behind me. So when I graduated and went to graduate school, he was still a senior. And as I said, when I went to graduate school, I took my first trip to Europe, and he was quite upset about the fact that he wasn't going along. He graduated and he went to the Yale School of Art. And there he was given a Fulbright and a Yale traveling scholarship and spent 2 years in Europe. When he went to the Prado and saw this painting, he was completely flabbergasted because of its success in putting the viewer into the art. This is what he said: I was still very young and trying to be a painter, and it knocked me sideways. I looked at it for a long time before it hit me that I was an extension of the painting. This was incredible to me, a real revelation. I had not seen anything like it before, and it made me think about art, about what I was doing in a radically different way. But at first, it just threw me into a state of total confusion. At that time, after that, he decided he wasn't going to be a painter because he could never equate what he did with this Velázquez. It is a mystery painting. We don't know what Velázquez is painting. It looks like he's painting us. He's behind the easel. He's aiming at us. But this painting is of the little Infanta and her helpers. And in the mirror, the king and queen are reflected, and that's where we are. So it's really a mystery. On my website, I have explanation in much more detail about this. It's one of the most intriguing paintings in art history. Now, in the 21st century, we have Manolo Valdez, who gave his photographic way that he thinks the painting was being done. We are now behind the artist. The artist is painting the Infanta. The Infanta and her helpers are looking into a mirror, and that's what he's painting. Something else in the 21st century that's going on right now is if you go to the Biennale or if you go to Venice right now, this parade of little Infantas is going through the Piazza San Marco. After we do the Baroque, we calm down a little bit with Romanticism, with going to nature, with doing mystical paintings. This is by Caspar David French. I've often shown his man contemplating the fog and the monk at the edge of the ocean, contemplating sort of the whole idea of the painting and nature being something that can take us out of ourselves into transcendence. Another thing about Romanticism, which we can also equate with drama or dramatizing, is history paintings that are done in the Romantic way. Romanticism is not talking about love between two people. It's talking about giving it a lyrical feeling, a feeling of greatness, a drama. And so here we have the most, and I don't like to use this word too much, but it's the most iconic painting in the French Republic because it stands for the French Republic. The woman's name that the French have given her is Marianne. Marianne is carrying the tricolore of France to celebrate another victory over the monarchy. The little boy to our right of Marianne is credited to being sort of an inspiration for Gavroche in Les Miserables. And the artist, E.D. That's Eugène Delacroix. And here in the 21st century, we see the Liberty newly refurbished. Look at how bright those colors are. They're hanging it back up in the great gallery of the Louvre. On the right, about I think a week or maybe 2 weeks afterwards, we have another one of those sort of revolts by the people who toss soup. They didn't toss soup at Liberty. What they did was they got over the barrier and they just made speeches about how people should be more aware of what's happening to the food chain because of the climate change, global warming. Géricault, along with Delacroix, were the great masters of these dramatic romantic history paintings. And here we see the story, a true story. He painted it about 2 years afterwards of these people whose ship had been shipwrecked and they made up this kind of a makeshift raft. They're all out on it and they are dying and their bodies are highlighted with the dark backgrounds. The sky is ominous. And Géricault, who we remember from our first class, remember he did the horses in our first class? He was an abolitionist and he used a black Haitian model for the man that's waving the flag in the back. And also there's another black person about 3 people to the right of the sail. When we get to Impressionism, we get a whole new world. From that time on, the changes in styles, in schools of art and eras of art changed so rapidly. Here we have the pastels, here we have the broad brush strokes. And I'm pretty sure here we have an artist that you know. Think back to the picture of Venice that we saw earlier. That was by Turner, who was an English impressionist. Here is a French impressionist that we've looked at many times. And that's Claude Monet. In our first class, we saw the series of haystacks that he did in different times of the day, different seasons, different light. Here is the cathedral at Rouen that he is able to show, if you looked at it in each one that was in detail, the details of the sculptures around the facade in great detail and different depending on the light. Camille Pissarro was kind of the old man of the Impressionists. He did a series also, and he did it of the street scene, the Boulevard Montmartre, which is right near where the Moulin Rouge is. Look at the two on the right column. The one on the top, daylight, the one in the bottom, nighttime, all the same scene. And this street scene is by our impressionist. He is an American impressionist. He was not part of the French school. We do have Mary Cassatt, who was American, but she was part of the French impressionist group. And here's Fifth Avenue. Look at the overall feeling of blue. Look at how they're just paint dabs that make up the people and the tops of the cars on the avenue. If we were up close, it wouldn't look like anything. But the view that we have here, we can look through that mist and make out Fifth Avenue. Contrast that with when we looked at the Ashcan School, when we looked at the dark tenement area of the lower part of Manhattan. And here on the side, we have the American flag along Fifth Avenue. And on the right, we can compare that with Monet's French flags, celebrating a holiday in France. These are all Impressionist works. They have the large types of brushstrokes. They have the use of light and the use of the pastels. This is also one from Child Hassan, and it is done in Maine on our East Coast. Beautiful garden of one of his friends. Look at how each one of the flowers is so well delineated. We feel them. We feel as if we're part of that garden. But once again, it's just done with those dabs of paint. When we get to post-impressionism, we again are playing with color, but we're using bright colors rather than the pastels. And we're putting them together in all sorts of crazy ways where they're not appropriate necessarily. Well, here's a master. It's hard to call him a post-impressionist because he had so much his own style. And that's Vincent van Gogh, who is showing us here a self-portrait of a very setting time when he cut off his ear after a bad quarrel with his roommate Gauguin, and it's all bandaged. But there's life and a little bit of joy in this because of the colors. Look at the way he has that smoke winding up. And of course, that fabulous background in the shades of red, rose that set off the figure. And then setting this figure with her hand on her cheek against that yellow background with that wonderful contrast of colors really sets it off and makes it unmistakably Van Gogh. Or does it? When we look at Van Gogh's history, he only painted for a very few years. He did start painting in Holland. This is the way he painted on the left. And on the right, after he got to the south of France and really, really burst out in a very, very forward way. Look at the dots that are forming the scarves on the ladies. Look at how that path of all those shades of orange goes along on the right. These lines, these separations of the colors, the yellows against the blue, they're like looking at a mosaic or a cloisonne where you just set in these big shapes of color. There's the picture that I was just showing you on the left, and on the right, this is not by Van Gogh, it's by an artist whose initials are PG. Again, we have that path. Again, we have those great big chunks of color. We have ladies in scarves. It looks as if there is a relationship between these artists. And of course, that is Paul Gauguin. Paul Gauguin did a night cafe in Arles when they were living together in the little yellow house. Look at his use of smoke, like we saw in the pipe in the Van Gogh self-portrait earlier. And then look at the position of the lady with her hand on her cheek. It is exactly the same type of woman from Arles, which is what Arlesienne means, as the Van Gogh on the right. And on the left, Van Gogh frequented that place, the billiard parlor, and he called this in a letter to his brother, Theo, my ugliest painting. I don't think it's ugly at all. I think it's wonderful. But I do look at the green, and I remember Maria's comment last week about absinthe, and that's exactly the color of absinthe. And I called it the green witch. It's really the green fairy, I realized later. But there's some on those tables, and there's people that are passed out. The whole thing is tipped as if we've had too much absinthe when we're looking at it. And look how he has shown the lights from the overhead lights. Look at the glare from them. Does it remind you of the Starry Night? Well, look also at the fact that both of them did very similar paintings, the frenemies, Van Gogh and Gauguin. So when we get to the fauves and we see that they're doing really bright, really crazy colors and mixing them all up topsy-turvy, we're getting on our way to abstraction. We're getting on our way to modern art. Whose Fauvis painting is this? He loves the windows. He loves that pink color. And look at how the paint is put on in the upper right-hand detail that I'm showing of this view of the town of Collioure, where the Fauvis painted together. Fauve means beastly. And critics thought that pictures like this were using colors in a very beastly manner. That's why they're called fauves. I think they're fabulous. The one on the left, I love. I know it's one of the stars in the permanent collection at San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. Look at the use of that fairy green that we have from the absinthe. And look at the green line that he proudly entitles his portrait here, the green line. Why not use arbitrary colors to make a painting? Is there a rule that says that a painting has to look exactly like the way we think we see people? So these are the fauves. Another fauve, AD, we've seen before. Look at the reflection on the water on the right, where he's used the big rectangles for the oranges and the yellows to make that. And he's using the rectangles in the water too. Remember back to Impression Sunrise by Claude Monet that gave the name to Impressionism. Remember that reflection? This is the way that a fauve would do it. Here is Derain on the left, showing us again that wonderful sun like we remember in the Monet, and the reflection like we had in Monet with a fauve touch. And just to remember what the Impressionists were doing, on the right, we have something by CM, once again, to contrast with the styles between these two movements. And yes, that was Claude Monet. In this picture of 3 Fauvis paintings, we have 2 by Derain and 1 by Matisse. I'm wondering if you pick out the Matisse. Well, it's the one in the center. And I think that the clue is the use of pink, but they're all doing the big chunks of color, taking us toward pointillism, where they have those big rectangles of color. And speaking of pointillism, pointillism is made by taking colors that are opposite on the color wheel, putting them side by side, creating new colors, so that what you see on the left, if you see the dots on the right, and if you squint, the character becomes more and more realistic. And of course, the poster picture for pointillism is the Sunday on the Grand Jatte, which is in Chicago. Here are wealthy people. They're out for a romp. They don't look as if they're romping particularly here. As a matter of fact, they look as if they're frozen, like the people in Kai Butt's The Rainy Day. But what I want you to look at also is the use of the dots, because what we see here, we don't see the dots. I'm showing you the demarcation between on the grass, between the sunny side and the shady side of the grass, and you can see the dots. And that was George Seurat. And here, completely different, are people who are middle class, and they're having a grand old time. And once again, although we see it looking realistic, it is a dot by dot picture. Now we're going to be getting into the abstract, which I've shown very little of in all these classes because there's very little to really talk about. It is just your reaction to the work. But I love this cartoon on the left. And one of the things about the classes that we've had are perhaps it makes it so you get cartoons that have to do with art. So you get this one. No, you're right. It's dumb. So this is when this particular cave artist decided to give up bison and hunter cave paintings and do this style, which somebody who's taken this class would know is by PM. We show his abstraction composition there, which started a whole fashion trend. You can see it on the cover of Vogue. You see the models in their A-line dresses posing with his picture down below. And that's Piet Mondrian, Dutch painter who went from painting things realistically to painting them abstractly. On the left, that's a very unusual way of painting a church by painting it through the branches. You also have the branches on the bottom, but it is definitely representational painting of a landscape in the church. But then you look in the middle, and what you see are the branches fading into a background. And then on the back, we have a total abstract that came from the painting on the left. And I love this one. This is his period with the squares and the lines. Broadway Boogie Woogie. I can just see the taxis just zipping around the avenues and the streets of New York City in this famous picture. Another abstract artist I think might be worth looking at is Robert Delaunay, French, who gave us what he called Orphism. And he has all sorts of meanings behind the way he does the circles and the intertwined, which mostly he understood, and it takes scholars to understand. And I think that what we can look at is just the design that he ended up with. His wife, Sonia Delaunay, was also very successful with similar work, but she also went into tapestry and fashion. You can see in the upper right example, the model that she's painted in to one of her abstract paintings. We've talked about this artist before who did color field paintings. Now we're talking pure color. We're talking about color that the way he does it, it blends one into the other in a very mystical kind of a way. And of course, that's Mark Rothko. We talked about his chapel last week. His real name is Marcus Rothkowitz. He was from Latvia. And you can see two of his typical paintings here. In abstract expressionism, we get painters, most popularly Jackson Pollock, who stand up with their painting, their paper on the floor, and with great action of their body and their arm, make the drips work into an abstract painting like you see in the upper right. Another one is Helen Frankenthaler. I don't think she probably got quite as active as Jackson Pollock and was also not as well known, but she's extremely well known now. She diluted her painting so that you can see her, looks like water that she's pouring on to the canvas below. And here she is on her painting and she has it draped in the background. And you can see how this interesting kind of a effect that she was able to get. Well, we have a wild and wonderful world of art after several millennia. So we're going to be going into the 21st century now. The artists who are working today are scrambling to be known, to have their works known. The prices are incredible. What they're doing with art is incredible. So we look at this cartoon that says, I get it. You don't want anything to do with the art world, but don't complain about being ignored. So that's kind of like what it's like today. I have an absolute ball. I still think of it as an imagination playground that I love playing in. One way that abstraction is being done differently is by Atakwame. And I want to thank Nan Farrell. She gave me many different contributions to this class. She's an artist and she loves working with color. And this is one of her contributions, and we'll have another one in a minute. But he takes his native fabrics from Ghana and jazz and other influences of street kiosks and West African towns to make his abstract paintings. And here are two. Like with the Delaunay, in the abstract, what we're looking at is color. What we're looking at is composition. And what we get from them is just the contact between one color, between two colors together, and the whole thing. I'm going to be showing you now three sort of obituaries for three abstract artists that we've lost this spring. The first one is Catherine Porter, and she was an abstract artist who has a very spontaneous way of creating, sometimes with symbols in them. For example, in the sailing one, we see the triangle that could be a sail. In the cyclamen, we see some shapes that could be flowers. And then there's Frank Stella. Frank Stella, extremely successful. You see his paintings in all the finest museums. And here you see him with a couple of them. I'm going to show you a video. And the reason I wanted to show a video about Frank Stella is that it's so true with so many artists as it is with him working into the 21st century. And that is that they go through many styles.
We've had word of a sad passing. World-famous artist Frank Stella died in Manhattan yesterday. A restless innovator who regularly reinvented himself, Stella ushered in an era of cool minimalism, all but ending the art world's fixation with abstract expressionism. In doing so, he became a towering figure in post-war American art. Moving from a palette of black to stripes of angular, vibrant colors, Stella consistently resisted being categorized or interpreted, famously saying, "What you see is what you see." He talked with our Martha Teichner in 2021.
I guess you'd say I'm restless up to a point, yeah. I can't help that.
Stella would restlessly abandon flat surfaces for assemblages and more. And when the Whitney Museum opened its new quarters in 2015, its inaugural retrospective was an exhibit of the works of Frank Stella. But Stella wasn't looking back. He was moving on to star-shaped creations like this one he called Jasper's Split Star. It stands in the plaza at New York's rebuilt World Trade Center. The artist's wife told the New York Times he died of lymphoma. The word for star in Italian is Stella. By any measure, 87-year-old Frank Stella was a star.
Did you see how at the end he was going off the wall? That's what Richard Serra did. And he passed away on March the 26th. Richard Serra was my high school boyfriend, and he created sculptures that you actually walk into, massive sculptures. I have a video on my website about his incredible work, but I'm just reminding you about his goal after seeing Las Meninas of trying to get the viewer into the work. He always walked around with a sketchbook. If you're talking to him, he would have to illustrate something on the spur of the moment. So he would do that. You see that in the video if you watch it. He is about ready to enter one of his sculptures. And if you want to enter one of his sculptures, the closest one, as I've mentioned before several times in the class, they have one at Stanford. They have Sequence, which I love because it's outside. So as you walk through it, the walls go out and come in. So it's a little bit dizzy making. And the play of light, since it's outside, is quite extraordinary. And this on the left is what that little painter from UCSB came to. And this was a complete gallery that Frank Gehry designed for the sculpture called A Matter of Time. You can see the man that's walking through it, and it goes all the way through. And then I just tossed in a picture when we were at UCSB when it was given the Distinguished Alumnus Award. So I told you I was going to get personal in this series. Now we're going to go back to nature, still being contemporary. Last Christmas, when I was in San Diego, I went to a show at the San Diego Museum of Art called Korea in Color. And when you walk in, there's this poster that tells you all the different meanings of the colors and the animals that you're going to be seeing in the exhibit. I was in the middle of doing this class on color, and I was taken away by it. And here we have one section, which was a section on gardens, on nature. And it had all the different symbolisms of how in the garden, there was different symbols of longevity in the bird and the flower paintings. Here is a mural-like one that's done in this very flat style where the colors just shine in the hollyhock field. And I thought I died and gone to heaven when I saw this one. I didn't write the word you on that chair. Art is about you. And I'm really going to miss when I go to museums now and to galleries, not thinking, oh God, I can share this with them. And here it is. Here's your just for fun finale final. In this picture, I've put all the artists who are responsible for the work that you see here. Now, even if you get one or two, and I'm sure that there's certain pictures that are sort of shining out at you, it will be a success. You probably knew a lot of these before you took this class. But what I'd like you to do is to look at the background on the left, at that sky. Go down and look at the wave. Come down to the table. At the very far end of the table on the left is a little tree. And hanging on the little tree is a little melted clock. To the right, there's a dog. Then you see a lovely naked lady with beautiful hair, an old man with a pitchfork. Next to him, you see a lovely lady who is dressed. Then the red label on the soup can. There you see in the background a man called the Son of Man with an apple in front of his face. Here you have a woman putting Thanksgiving dinner on the table. Next to her, a vase of sunflowers. Behind that, a very lovely naked man sculpture. Then on the right, we see a very upset figure. Down to the right, maybe this is what made him upset, I don't know. A woman in profile. In the background, we have this wonderful cafe. And in the back of the cafe, we see a statue of a lady who has no arms. We have a statue of a man who's leaning his head on his hands, and then a whole group of people who are dressed just alike. Well, you might have a couple of these that you recognize from the classes, and I'm going to show you the answer in a second. So here we have Van Gogh's sky, Hokusai's wave. That branch with a melted clock on it is Salvador Dali. Coolidge, I would never have got, but everybody knows the painting. And it's one of the America's favorite paintings, and that's the dogs playing poker. Botticelli's Venus. Grant Wood's Old Man from American Gothic. Then you have Leonardo's Mona Lisa, Warhol's Soup Can, Magritte's Son of Man, Surrealism. You have Norman Rockwell's Thanksgiving, Van Gogh's Sunflowers, Michelangelo's David. Then you have The Scream by Munch. You have Whistler's Mother down at the end of the table. The whole cafe is Edward Hopper's Night Cafe from the Nighthawks. At the counter, we have the Venus de Milo, Rodin's The Thinker, and then those men are all Rembrandt's drapers. That's all, folks. I hope you really enjoyed it. I sure enjoyed playing with you. I think art is a great, big, wonderful playground.